Hello guys, it's Obley here with another video for you. Today we're going to be running through all the Mythic Plus dungeons of Season 1 and then popping them into a tier list, with S rank being the best dungeon, fun dungeon, good dungeon to run, D rank being the worst dungeons you could possibly get on your key, instant reroll, whatever you do. Right, we've got this tier list that I made here, we're going to run through it now. So, first things first, in first place. This right here is very hard to see, but it is Siege of Boralus. And Siege of Boralus is a good dungeon. I think, in my opinion, it's one of the easier dungeons to do. If you're looking at bosses, they're not that difficult. I mean, walking through it in my head, the hardest part of the dungeon is like the first part of the dungeon. Then after that, it's just making sure you don't wipe between the second and third boss. The last boss is relatively difficult. However, on a 10, I mean, the overall difficulty curve of the dungeon is quite flat. It's just a standard amount of difficulty throughout the entire thing. I wouldn't say that like the bosses are particularly difficult compared to anything else. So I'm going to put that as an 8. It's not like it's really easy. It's not like it's a breeze. But you get this key, and if it's a high level, you're probably going to complete it. Alright, next dungeon here we have the Dawnbreaker. So the Dawnbreaker is actually one of my personal favourite dungeons, especially for a Frost DK. Everything lines up really well there. So if you can plan out your cooldowns to use them effectively, this is a great dungeon for us. First boss, you can get full uses of your breath if you're using Breath of Sindragosa. You don't need to worry about moving out or anything like that. The rest of the dungeon is pretty much just like an ad pad fest for us. Like, it is fantastic. And if you go the church way, your cooldowns are lining up really well. Now the main pointer I would give out here is just press your cooldowns on cooldown, because you're guaranteed to have them up during the boss fight at least one time. Another pointer would be at the end of the dungeon when you're doing the moth boss, Rasharan. Change your burst at the start, you'll get your burst again at the end. So I'm going to pop that in A. I think that's definitely an easier dungeon to do. It's not that dangerous, especially for us with AMS. You can get rid of quite a lot of the annoying mechanics that are there, like when the second boss is shooting the orb and you're targeted. We're slow, we don't get out of that very quickly. However, you can AMS, so you don't have to worry about that mechanic. So pop that at A. The next dungeon we have here is Grim Batol. This dungeon is the bane of my existence. This is a horrible dungeon, very difficult. Everything hits really hard. You definitely want to be speccing into stuns here, because at the latter half of the dungeon you want to be helping out by stunning the enforcers and getting rid of their own rage buff. Just by stunning them completely wipes all of their stacks and they start again from 0. Your tank will thank you. This dungeon is very tank dependent, and your tank will die a lot, especially with those little lads between third and last boss. The last boss itself is also quite a challenging boss, as Mythic Plus bosses go. I would say every single pack in here is pretty dangerous, especially the ones in the second boss room with the big giants. They can just destroy your tank, and then the magma wave, if your healer's got off guard, is going to decimate everyone. So I would say this is easily one of the worst ones so far. So definitely a D tier dungeon. It's a good dungeon. I actually like the dungeon, but it's just hard. That's all. Good loot as well. I'd say maybe it's actually more of like a C tier than D tier, just because it is a good dungeon, in my opinion. We'll leave it at C for now, I think. The next dungeon we have here is Ara-Kara. So this, again, pretty easy dungeon. You can go through you're pretty much only going to wipe between the first boss and the second boss. The rest of it is not too bad. I mean, the trash, arguably, before the third boss, you could say is difficult trash, but realistically, you want to be planning your route so you go around the double overseer at the bottom with the massive scarab. If you do that, the dungeon is so much easier. I'd say all of the trash is pretty easy. Just focus the big scarabs. They take 100% damage, whereas everything around them only take 50%, so get them down as quick as possible and interrupt Revolting Volley. There is nothing else really dangerous about those packs. So Ara-Kara, easily a very a good dungeon. Drops good loot as well, and the only problem with it is the last boss. The last boss is quite difficult, but it's only if you don't understand how the mechanics work, which we could say that about every boss fight in that case. And therefore, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that it deserves to go a step down because of that. I wouldn't say that the difficulty level of Ara-Kara versus the difficulty level of Siege would be in the same row. So for that, I give it an S tier. Good loot, good fight, quick as well. We love a quick dungeon. Easily the best one by far. Next up we have Necrotic Wake. Now this is a dungeon which is extremely difficult at the moment. You could say that there is a point where you actually can't do it entirely. If you don't have any weapons to help you with the third boss, it's pretty much key over. Especially in the higher keys, if you're looking at 10s, if you don't have any weapons to use in that third boss, if you use them all and you wipe for some reason because the stacks of Festering Rot are too high, this dungeon is pretty much unplayable. So I would say that arguably this is the hardest dungeon of the lot. You have to pull everything in the instance, bar just a few packs at the start in order to make count, and every single pack is just as difficult as the next. They did give a nerf to the necromancers, so it's slightly easier to do those. I mean, if you're missing like 3-4%, I would say just do a necromancer. If your healer's just ready for it, they should be able to heal up the AoE that it does quite easily. However, the rest of the dungeon, everything apart from maybe the second boss, is difficult. First boss has a level of difficulty that's quite high, I'd say. All the trash is difficult. If you use the items well, then you can make it slightly more medial, but the trash hurts. The trash can cause wipes. Even the trash when you go upstairs is harder. It seems like every pack, the trash in it is harder than the last pack that you just fought. The only redeeming quality is the fact that between the third and the fourth boss there is no trash. Because of the fact that the last boss is difficult as well, but you're not even using the weapons on the last boss, you're using it on the third boss. So there's 3 very difficult bosses unless your group is switched on, and one boss which is made easier with a DK. But if it wasn't for the DK, it'd still be a difficult one. Because of that, easily it's the worst. Easily it's the hardest. The next dungeon we'll talk about is City of Threads. Now, this dungeon is very difficult. It has a very difficult array of bosses, really. So first, second and fourth are all very hard, with the third one being relatively simple mechanic wise. A lot of output is needed. The trash isn't so bad here. It's annoying to have that little game in the middle where you have to find the clones. It's different, that's fine. However, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's something that everybody actually enjoys doing. You kind of just have to do it, of course. All the trash, especially the caster trash, suck. But it's not too difficult. It's just the bosses that are hard, and for that reason I think it would be more of a C or B. I think B, because the trash isn't that hard in comparison to the bosses. I'd say with Grim Batol, the trash and the bosses are difficult, but it's a good dungeon, and you can eventually smash your head against the wall and you'll get it done. Obviously with Necrotic Wake, the trash and the bosses are hard, but there's a point where you probably just cannot do the dungeon. If you don't have the weapons to bring, you just don't do it. You have to just leave. So for that reason, I'd say City of Threads is more like a B. The next dungeon for me is the Stonevault. Now, the Stonevault was a bit of a mixed bag, because at the start of the season everybody was saying it was quite difficult. However, I think as time's gone on, they've realised the bosses and it's not quite as hard anymore. However, the trash is still no joke. The bosses aren't too hard, but I think because this dungeon is more figuring out the mechanics, and once you have that down mechanically, you'll be going into this dungeon fine every time. There's not necessarily as much of a skill cap once you're doing the mechanics properly. With the first boss, you're just making sure those pillars are gone. With the Skarmrak boss, you're just making sure you don't kill the ads all at the same time, and keeping your buff up. With the boss, the dual boss, you're just making sure that you're interrupting, not standing in anything. And then with the last boss, you're just making sure that you're popping your debuffs as far away as possible, and using any immunities to get rid of void corruption. So I'd say that the bosses aren't really very hard in Stonevault. The trash is more difficult. The trash between, the trash in front of the last boss is like the hardest part of the dungeon, and then that big massive pool that you do at the start, if you do that. Because of that, I would say that this dungeon is probably more of like a B tier, because it's not really that hard, but it does take a while to get used to the dungeon, and once you do know the mechanics, obviously, I mean, it's stupid to say that once you know the mechanics it's easy, but with this dungeon it really does prove that once you do have the mechanics down, it isn't that hard. Last but not least, we have Mist of Scythe. Now, Mist is probably one of the best dungeons alongside Ara-Kara, I would say. Lots of AoE, It's a nice dungeon to be in. The bosses aren't too difficult. I mean, the worst boss is definitely the guessing game boss, the second boss, just because I personally hate it, because she does the guessing game cast when she's on 7%. That's just annoying. But the dungeon as a whole is quite good. The difficulty comes in the very last boss. I think if you were going to wipe in this dungeon, it would be either the first boss, where you don't really spend your cooldowns wisely and you can't burst them down, or you don't kill the tree fast enough so that you don't have to spend too much time with the other boss just meandering around. But the last boss is probably the most difficult part of the dungeon, I would say. You just have to be very on it with getting away from everything on the floor. As a DK, it's fucking hard because we're really slow. And we want to be, especially when you're breathing, you want to be close to the boss to be keeping that breath up. When it does its sort of like phase ability, phase AoE, it's really difficult to actually stay there and not die. Not to mention the fact that if you step into any pools just this second, you take a massive chunk of your health. However, the rest of the dungeon is relatively simple, and as it's a Shadowlands dungeon, we're quite used to it if you have played before. That could give it some sort of like pseudo difficulty decrease because we've done it before. But I mean, if that was the case, you'd kind of be that way about Necrotic Wake, but that's still probably the hardest dungeon there is. For that reason, for all those reasons mentioned just now, I would say that Mist is probably an S tier dungeon. It's a good dungeon. It's a quick dungeon. Lots of AoE, lots of nice damage numbers. Good dungeon. So there we have it, guys. So this is my perspective and my personal opinion on the dungeons that we have currently in rotation in terms of tier list. I'd say the best dungeons at the moment are definitely Ara-Kara and Mist of Tirna Scithe. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to tell you that. There's probably everybody in the entire world is telling you, yeah, Ara-Kara and Mist are the best. But it is true, and that is still the same from a FrostDK perspective. Great dungeon to have. In terms of A, B, and C, for A, Siege of Boralus, definitely. I just think it's a great dungeon. I know a lot of people hate it. I think it's mainly because of things like the gripping mechanics, and you can't really see a lot of the visuals. But other than that, I think it is good. Good aesthetically. It's a long dungeon, which doesn't play towards its favour. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily a shit dungeon. I'd say because it's a fun dungeon to do, it doesn't feel that long. Dawnbreaker being actually kind of a shorter dungeon if you do it properly and you aren't wiping a lot. It's also just a fun dungeon to be in, I think. I personally really like the aesthetic of being up and like flying around. I think it's cool. Like the mobile unit, even though it does have a lot of bugs, I do think it's quite cool that there's this big fucking balloon that we get to ride on, and it goes around, and it's kind of dynamic with the environment as you progress through the dungeon. I just think that's cool, and I don't think the dungeon is too difficult if you have a good healer for the second boss as well. Then at B and C, you've got Scithe and you've got Stonevault. They're difficult in their own respects, but I would say that they're not necessarily. You can just keep banging against the wall, and you will defeat these dungeons, just maybe not in time. With Grim Batol, that's an extremely hard dungeon. It's the same deal where you, with a lot of focus, you will eventually get there, but it is violent from start to finish. The trash, the bosses, everything. And last but not least, the fact that Necrotic Wake, there is a point where you can get all the way through the dungeon to the third boss, and then you spent all your weapons. If you wipe, the next time you go around, that's it, you're done. You can't do it. I think for that reason, that's definitely in the bottom spot. Thanks very much for watching, everybody. Feel free to visit my Twitch to see more Death Knight gameplay. Thank you very much. Speak to you soon. Bye.